Good evening.
Good evening.
I haven't been out today, but I hear it's wet. So I'm glad everybody's here safely, and I hope that you're going to get home safely this evening. I'm not going to keep you too long. You know, we just sing that song, Sing to Me of Heaven, and I just had the weirdest thought while I'm singing it. Do you ever have weird thoughts while you sing? Sing to me of heaven, tenderly and low. And I just thought, wouldn't it be awesome if Barry White could sing to me of heaven just tenderly and real low? I know that probably was inappropriate to even mention here, but I just thought it. So anyway. Well, let's look at Mark 5. That's a lot better for us to talk about than my Barry White fantasies. Mark chapter 5. If you don't know who Barry White is, you need to listen to him tonight a little bit. Well, you'll understand. It's a simple story here in Mark chapter 5, but there's some amazing things that I think are seen and some wonderful principles that can be learned as we look at the synagogue ruler and the Son of God who helped him. So let's take a look at the text in Mark chapter 5, verses 22 through 24, first of all. Let's see what's going on here. Can you hit that zoom button down 2 times for me? Yeah. Thank you. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. The he there, of course, is Jesus, who goes with Jairus. And it's Jesus who goes with Jairus so that he might come and heal her. But I want you to think for just a minute about what a big deal it was that Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, what a big deal it was that he actually came and asked Jesus in the first place. And I want you to consider, first of all, in order for him just to ask that question and to do what he did, what he would have had to have laid aside. As this encounter begins between Jairus and Jesus, we might think about what the synagogue ruler had to lay aside in order to gain the Lord's help. And the first thing is this: he would have had to have laid his prejudices aside. Now, why might a ruler of the synagogue have had prejudices towards Jesus, or prejudice toward him? And I would suggest to you that one of the reasons a ruler of a synagogue would have prejudice toward Jesus is because of the opinions of many of the Lord's enemies. John chapter 12, notice what we read about some of the other rulers of the Jewish people. It says in John chapter 12 and in verse 42, even among the rulers, Jairus might have been one of those, was one of those, a ruler of the synagogue, but even among the rulers, many believed in Jesus, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him. And so there was some societal, some class pressure, even though people might have believed in Jesus, to not admit it in the presence of other people. We can see that same type of pressure occur in academia. We can see that type of pressure occur among those who consider themselves to be scientifically minded. They might believe in Jesus, they might admire Jesus, but they are very afraid to say anything because of the political and academic and cultural circles they run in. And so one of the first things that we see in this story of Jairus coming to Jesus in the first place is that he would have had to lay aside any prejudice that would have been fostered by the opinions of the enemies of Jesus to come and make the request in the first place. And so prejudice had to be laid aside. I want to suggest to you, as we read Mark chapter 5, that dignity had to be laid aside. He lays aside his dignity. He's a leader in the community and a ruler of the synagogue. Can you imagine a religious leader or a political leader laying at the feet of a doctor and laying at the feet of a surgeon in the middle of a hospital and publicly falling at their feet, groveling and begging for help? You know, that's what Jairus does here. In verse 22, when he saw him, he fell at his feet. He sees Jesus, he falls down and begged him earnestly. And so he lays aside his dignity in order to come and make this request of Jesus. We might connect laying aside his dignity to having to lay aside his pride. He lays aside his pride. And he lays aside his pride in that he has to ask for help for a need that is beyond his own ability. You know, it's tough for some men to even ask for directions when they're lost. And here's a man who rules the religious synagogue himself, admitting that he has a problem he can't fix. Sometimes that's hard for us to admit, that we have some needs and we have some problems that we can't fix on our own without the help of others. And so Jairus lays aside his prejudice, his dignity, his pride. And fourthly, he lays aside how his friends might view him. Imagine you're laying down at the feet of Jesus, begging for Jesus' help. Your friends might think you're a little nutty, right? I think that that's a bit unbecoming of a leader. It's a bit undignified for someone with a man of his reputation. It's a bit strange. You might see that as strange, but he's still willing to do it in order to get the point across to Jesus that he desperately needs his help. And finally, I would suggest to you the ruler lays aside his comfort. He has to leave his home. And sometimes in order to seek help, you've got to get up and you've got to go. Jesus speaks often of the importance of us. If we're truly seeking God, we're going to go. We're going to seek. We're going to knock. Those are things that take activity, action. Take us getting out of our comfort zone sometimes in order to find the help that we need. Jairus is willing to do that. Now, more importantly, that's what he did. But I want you to think about why he did it. Jairus lays aside all of these things because he loved his daughter. He loves his daughter. And so that's one of the next things that we see. He's got a 12-year-old girl. That's what it says there in the text. It says that he's got a 12-year-old daughter. It was his only daughter. And love for our children can make us do some pretty crazy stuff, right? Love for our children leads to sleepless nights sometimes. Love for our children leads to long talks. We could be doing other things. Sometimes we need to have those long lectures and those long talks. Love for our children leads to expensive medical bills that we're willing to pay because it's our kids and we love them and want to see them get better. Love for our children leads to braces because we want our children to get married someday. We just want to give you a chance. Love for our children leads to tough love sometimes. It leads to late night projects. Do you hear me, kids? Yeah. Sometimes it leads to helping out with science fairs. I would never want to do a science fair. It's not because I like science that I would stay up and help my children with this. It's because I love my children that we do things like that. Leads to early morning ball games. When we love our kids, here's just the big point. We'll sacrifice for them. We'll make sacrifices when we love our children. And he loved his daughter. He realized that his daughter was in pain, and there was some hurt. And her pain hurt him. When we truly love, that's going to be the case. In fact, that's what I think Paul tries to get across in Romans 12. It says that we should rejoice with those who rejoice, but we weep with those who weep. We recognize their pain, and we absorb some of that pain in ourselves when we truly love and care for others. Her pain hurt him. That's why he did it. That's why he was willing to go that that extra mile and willing to lay aside all those things, her pain hurt him. When loved ones are hurting, we're going to take extreme measures to come out of our shells, to do something that is unconventional, to do things that are untraditional, things that we may not have ever expected or seen ourselves doing in order to help other people, to relieve the pain. And he did it because he wanted her to live. His daughter was deathly ill, and he wanted her to live. Family table, imagine it would be quite empty without her sitting around it. His little girl, he wanted her to be at that table again. He wanted the family to go on as usual. He didn't want to see her life cut short. So he did it because he wanted her to live. He made a decisive decision because her need mattered a lot more than his pride. Who cares what the world thinks? Who cares how it would make him look? There was a little girl who needed help, and that's all that mattered. In Luke 10, we read about the story of the Good Samaritan. And one of the points that we always make from the story of the Good Samaritan is this. Here is the priest that walked by, the Levite walked by, but the Samaritan took the time to help someone who is in need. Now, someone had a different religious belief system than him, if it was a devout Jew, in comparison and contrast to a Samaritan. The person may have even looked different. May not have looked quite the same. May have been a slightly different color. His hair might have been a little bit kinkier and different. You might have been able to tell even from his clothing, or his clothing was taken, I think. The Samaritan may very well have known, based upon evidences, traits, that he was different, but it didn't matter. It matters there was somebody that was in need, and he helped. Between the Jew and the Samaritan, there was a world of history and differences, but all the Samaritan saw was a need. And the reason why the ruler did it was because he believed Jesus could help. He was the only one that could save her. And so that was the only logical person to come to. Nobody else that he knew of could do it, so he goes to the source. So what happens? Well, Jairus, we know what he did, and I think we see why he did it, but let's notice what happens when Jesus finally comes to his daughter. And look at Mark chapter 5, verse 35. Mark 5, verse 35. You notice there's a little gap because there's actually a miracle in between this while Jesus was on his way there. But we're going to look at verse 35. While he was still speaking, while Jesus is still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" That's sad news. He'd taken the time to leave his home, and while he's gone, his daughter has died. You know, that's a sad thing for some people. I remember when my grandmother died, we'd been sitting around her bed for some time at the hospital, been up for hours waiting with her, and my car was parked somewhere where it wasn't supposed to be parked. I got up to move it, and while I was gone for that 20 minutes, my grandmother died in the room. I was kind of mad. Well, why did she do that? Why? You want to be there for that moment around your loved ones. Sometimes we're not. Sometimes we can't be. But that's his daughter. And when your daughter is experiencing that type of pain, and during those last moments, you want to be the one, if you truly love, you want to be the one who's there with them. And so that must have been a hurtful thing to hear. Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. And Jesus saw a commotion. This has just happened. It's fresh. People are grieving. And they are weeping and they are wailing loudly. And when he'd entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother, be Jairus and his wife, and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. There's some things that I think we can learn from that little section, and they're things that really are the types of things that make us admire Jesus. From the account, now it's complete, we see a wonderful example of why we delight in Jesus rather than men. And I want you to notice the contrast in the text. Here's the first thing. Why is it that we delight in Jesus? It's because Jesus gives hope while men only despair. Take a look at verse 35. Verse 35, the people come out and they say, your daughter is dead. It's hopeless, is what they're saying. It's hopeless. There's no point. Why are you troubling the teacher any further? And yet Jesus is there offering hope in the midst of despair. It's one of the things that we appreciate about Jesus. While the rest of the world looks at grim situations that occur and the sad things that happen, some people even look at death and eternity without hope. Jesus is there in the midst of despair and hopelessness offering hope. Something that you can grasp onto. Notice the second thing as we see a contrast, and that is, while people fear, he has faith. Look at verse 36. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler, don't be afraid, only believe. It's obvious that he says don't be afraid because he was afraid. He was afraid his daughter was dead. He was afraid the situation was grim. There was no hope. It was a helpless situation now. And while men see their fear, we see Jesus having and calling for faith in his power. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7, that's a passage we're going to look at in Bible class next Sunday. But it's a passage that says God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. While the rest of the world may have a spirit of fear, we don't. We've got courage and faith that Jesus can conquer any problem. What else do we see in the midst of this? Well, verse 38. Verse 38, it says, he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and he saw a tumult. Here's commotion. Here are these people who are saying, imagine it, a 12-year-old has died. This isn't someone where in their old age we perhaps are expecting them, knowing that they're older, that death may be near. This is someone 12. We think that they have their whole life ahead of them. They've still got marriage. They've still got children. They've still got families to raise. They still have so much ahead of them. They're 12 years old. The grief for a 12-year-old and a child and someone young is so much different than the grief of when someone's older. There's still grief there, but you know it's different. And so there's commotion and there's chaos and there's a tumult. People are weeping and they're wailing loudly. In verse 39, when he came in, he said to them, why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, it's sleeping. Jesus offers calm in the midst of all the commotion. While the world throws their hands up in the air and grieves and wails and mourns and cries, it's Christ who calmly reaches out and says, I'll give you rest. I'll give you a break from these burdens. And I'll give you peace. Notice verse 40. And notice just a fourth thing about why we delight in Jesus. Jesus offers hope. Jesus instills faith. Jesus offers calm. And Jesus is genuinely concerned while other people mock. Verse 40. Jesus has just said the child is not dead but sleeping. And it says they ridiculed him. Some versions will say they laughed at him. You're nuts, Jesus. That's crazy. We see their mockery and their laughter and his concern. Despite their scorn, he doesn't care that they don't believe and they don't like what he said and that they're hopeless. He's still concerned and he's still genuine with them. And then the last thing we see about Jesus is while they just resign and quit and say it's hopeless, Jesus acts. And so in verse 41, he took the child by the hand. He said to her, Talitha cumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. They're back there laughing, thinking that it's hopeless, ridiculing him, mocking him. And Jesus is inside acting in love and in power to raise this girl. These are the qualities that make us love and that make us admire Jesus. It may be a simple story. It may be a simple story, but it's a story that for us, it's a story that helps us to realize that we shouldn't live a life of despair, of hopelessness, of chaos, of resignation, but we should realize that we serve a risen Lord and a Lord who gives us hope, who offers us calm, and who cares about us. Have you put your faith in that Jesus? Life isn't hopeless without Him. And so you need to take your pride, you need to put it aside. Quit worrying about what other people will think as you come before Jesus and you submit yourself to Him and do His will, because He's the one that's got true power to change lives. If you haven't yet come to Him, why don't you come while we stand, while we sing.